It is Wednesday, January 31, 2007. My name is Don Linky. This is another in the series of interviews that the Eagleton Institute is coordinating for the Rutgers program on the governor for the Brendan T. Byrne Archive, a history of Brendan Byrne's career and the Byrne administration. We're going to talk with Tom Cochran, who served as a special assistant to the governor and also later became the first executive director of the Northeast Midwest Institute in Washington. Subsequently, Tom joined the private sector and has been involved in a variety of roles since. We're going to discuss the office of the governor as Brendan Byrne started his administration and also as it evolved over time. We begin with your first recollections of meeting Brendan Byrne. When was that?
Wow, that's an interesting question. It must have been, I don't actually have a clear recollection of first meeting him. I'd had nothing to do with the campaign. I was in graduate school and didn't even think I was going to work in the state. So it would have been after I was asked to join the council's office, and I don't have a clear recollection of when it first was. I'm sure that it wasn't a one-on-one. It was some small group, and probably when the governor came to the council's office. But I don't have a clear recollection.
How did it come about that you did join the administration?
Well, I was recruited at the Woodrow Wilson School in a traditional recruitment process that Luke Hayden had set up and asked Bob Ramar to run. And they interviewed probably 5 or 6 of us. You'd have to ask Bob to recollect more clearly, but a number of us about a couple of policy positions that Lou thought he could maintain in the council's office, and so Ramar came by and conducted a pretty traditional interview, and I had known Ramar's father a little bit from the congressional campaign that I had run in '72, which was the Fred Bowen for Congress campaign against Peter Frelinghuysen. And Bob Ramar's father was a good, active Democrat in Somerville. And I think that knowing the Ramar name might have helped me a little bit, but I was probably also the only person being interviewed from the Woodrow Wilson School, at least, that was really interested in education finance reform, that kind of stuff. So I don't think there was a huge amount of competition for the job.
And of course, Bob Ramar was an assistant counsel
Yes.
in the governor's office. Luke
Right.
Hayden was the special counsel, which
Right.
in effect was the counsel's office.
That's right.
Well, let's go back earlier. How did you get interested in politics and your upbringing to get you into Democratic politics and later into Brendan Byrne's administration?
Yeah, well, I grew up in one of those families where there was just always interest in public issues, and a lot of dinner table discussion about right and wrong in public in the public issues of the time. And my parents were not good Democrats. They, if I recall correctly, they used to make it a point to tell us that they never voted for FDR, that they always voted for the socialist candidate, who was usually Norman Thomas, I think. And used to be proud of that. Now they're still alive, and I've asked them to verify this lately, and they their memories are a little hazier than they used to be. But I suspect the story is pretty accurate. But it was a very comfortable household. My dad was an architect, very successful architect, and architects have never been paid, gigantic sums of money, but we always had a comfortable sort of upper middle class existence. And my brother, who's 5 years older, was extremely interested in the civil rights movement from the time he was 8 or 10 years old. He was also much more overtly interested in politics from about that age. And I remember him, one of my earliest memories is my brother getting beat up at school for having worn an Adlai Stevenson pin, the pin with the shoe with the hole in it. And he had been very proud to have that pin. It was given to him by Adlai Stevenson on a whistle-stop campaign thing. So, little incidents like that probably had a lot to do with my interest in the family tradition. And then when I was in college, my brother was then heavily involved in the formation of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, and then was beat up on national television in 1962 while we were living in Lake Forest, Illinois, not your normal hotbed of interest in the civil rights movement or even democratic politics. And there, my brother led the news on the Huntley-Brinkley report. He was supposed to have come home from his freshman year in college at Swarthmore College, and instead had gone to Cambridge, Maryland, and that was the town of that summer, actually, for H. Rap Brown and the whole crowd were there. And then he went missing. He went missing when he was taken into custody, and for 3 days we didn't know whether he was alive or dead. And my parents were hiring private detectives and everything to try to make sure he was, not being abused any further and that he was still alive. So those are some kind of vivid things that happened in my growing up that probably made me more interested than a lot of my friends. And then I was heavily involved in the anti-war movement in college, and but I thought I was going to be a teacher. A teacher of social studies, and I have my secondary school teaching certificate in the state of Wisconsin. I was at Beloit College in Wisconsin, a tough little dying heavy industry town on the Rock River, just north of the Illinois border. And but I was going to be a teacher, I thought, and then I had one of those breaks, which I kind of went after casually, but I won a fellowship that the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation was sponsoring to work in city government in New York. And so I was still enrolled as an undergraduate, but I got this fabulous chance to work with the John Lindsay office of the mayor on the school decentralization crisis, and really the aftermath of the crisis when I arrived, and we were trying to set up the 32 community school districts and so on. So that move from sort of the worm's eye view of a school teacher to the sort of bird's eye view of a policy making, decision-making office was the biggest change that has ever happened in my life. That completely changed my direction and led pretty directly to being interested in working for Brendan Byrne when the opportunity came.
Any more recollections about your time in New York?
Oh, well, I mean, that's another couple hours, right? But It was a pretty wild and crazy time because the law had just been passed to, I guess by the time I arrived, it had been enacted for 6 or 8 months. And the community school districts had been created by fiat, basically, but trying to make them work was the problem. And after working in the mayor's office for a number of months for the mayor's assistant for education, Sally Bowles, right down the hall from the mayor's crisis management team headed by Barry Goddard, which was a whole nother trip. We were sort of the policy people, and we were supposed to be staying on top of the union and so on. These folks down the hall were out there with their beepers and their police cars and two-way radios. They were all civilians, but they were monitoring the crisis districts and trying to make sure there weren't any more riots and that any more people were injured or killed in the transition from the experimental school districts to the 32 district system. And Barry Goddard, a long time ago, wrote a very interesting memoir called The Mayor's Man about that operation. And if you're really interested in that period, I can't think of a better single source to get the feel of how that all went. I then was shifted over to the chancellor's office at the Board of Education, the New York City Board of Education, and so I entered what at that time we thought of as the belly of the beast, the 110 Livingston Street, and I was made part of a group of, I think there were no more than 8 of us professionals who were federally funded to try to make the community school district system work in a building of maybe 3,500 people who were all dead set against it and doing everything they could to collude with the union to undermine the system and make it ineffective. They really did hope to see the collapse of the community school districts within a few years, and that was a situation that I worked in for a year and a half, and ended up feeling I didn't know enough, didn't have enough professional training to really be a very effective person. I was very young. I was 22 or something like that. A psych major from Wisconsin. And so I got a chance to go to the Woodrow Wilson School and took it because I really started to feel out of my depth. And, although what I learned and the experience of it was just priceless. There had been a book, you may remember this book, it was called 110 Livingston Street. It was by a famous sociologist of government called Rutgers, I think. And it was 1,000 pages long. And this book had come out just a year or two before I got to the Board of Ed, and all you had to know to sort of navigate through the Board of Ed was to read the appropriate chapter of the book, and all the characters in it were named. There was no attempt to disguise the names or anything, and I was dealing with all these characters in this famous book. So that was quite a trip. Yeah. But everything in New Jersey seemed fairly calm, actually, compared to that.
Now, at what point did you get involved in the Bowen congressional campaign?
Oh, well, because you wanted to know sort of how I got started politically. I got started politically as a volunteer helping run the western half of Pennsylvania for the Muskie for President campaign. And Dick Leone, interestingly enough, was in charge of Pennsylvania altogether. So we basically, the guy who had gotten me involved is a fellow called Blair Butterworth. Blair and I were basically reporting to Dick Leone, though I never saw him the whole time. He pretty much stayed to the Philadelphia area and let us flounder around with the western part of the state, because like the day after I arrived, Muskie had the emotional outburst in New Hampshire, and so everything was starting to come apart. And but that was how I cut my teeth in actual, political work. Although that's not quite true. When I was still at Beloit College in Wisconsin, I had done a little bit of volunteer work for Pat Lucey, who became governor of Wisconsin, and who ended up having to confront the same kind of property tax and school aid issues as we did. Which explains why I was always the one in the council's office who kept banging away for a rebate system, as basically a civics lesson to let the citizens know that yeah, we were taking more money for income tax, but that we were trying to use it for a purpose of property tax equalization, and because Pat Lucey had done it and done it successfully.
Now, during the Muskie campaign was while you were still in Woodrow Wilson?
No, I was still working for the Board of Ed, and
Yeah,
I just used all my vacation time to go out and campaign for Muskie.
Okay. Did you have any contact with Dick Leone during that
No.
short-lived campaign?
No, I mean, he was a name. I didn't know him. I hadn't gone to the Woodrow Wilson School yet, so I didn't really know about him academically either. When I got to the school, he had, I think, just completed his PhD dissertation there, and he was a fairly famous figure around the campus because his intellect and sort of feistiness about policy issues had become widely known. But no, I didn't really have any contact with him there.
So you get to New Jersey and you get involved again politically in New Jersey politics.
With the Bowen campaign, exactly. And I knew I was going to have to quit my job at the Board of Ed to go to school in the fall. And after the presidential campaigns were over, this same fellow that had gotten me involved in the Muskie campaign, whose parents lived in Princeton, had been approached by Fred Bowen to manage the campaign, and asked me if I would get involved, if not as the manager, at least as one of the regional managers. And I said, well, sure, okay, I'll do that. But what happens when September rolls around and I'm supposed to go to class? And, well, we'll figure that out. Well, we never figured it out, and I didn't show up at class until, I just showed up at a few classes, but basically knocked off school until Fred lost the campaign, and but honorably with a much higher total than he was supposed to have gotten. And then I showed up for classes sheepishly, and only one professor just threw me out, and because the other ones figured that they could basically grade me out, and because they thought their courses were that tough, and in those days that was just not true. And I wasn't the only one who came in the day after the elections. There were a couple of people who had been working for McGovern, and somebody was working for a Republican candidate. And we all showed up, and none of us got flunked out. But I was still living in New York and commuting to graduate school, and I kept doing consulting work during the rest of graduate school, and I've always kind of regretted that, and regretted that we didn't move down to Princeton, because I didn't really participate as fully as I now wish I had in the graduate school experience. It's an amazingly rich place to learn things, and if you just show up for classes, you're only getting, a fraction of what it has to offer. And the school felt the same way, and they then enacted a rule that you couldn't live outside of a pretty tight radius in the Princeton area, and so that doesn't happen anymore.
Now, when you're interviewed by Bob Raymore, how did he describe the position that they were looking for you to fill?
Very vaguely. I mean, it was help us with policy research and analysis on education and probably health. And, literally 2 or 3 sentences. And but if you go to a public policy school like the Woodrow Wilson School, you have some sense of what that's going to be. I mean, it was before they would call us all policy. What's that term? Wonks. Yeah. But in those days, it was policy jocks, and there was a general understanding of what staff to mayors or governors would do, and I had been working in the mayor's office in New York, so I had some sense of what it would be, and I also had a sense that it would be different on different days or different weeks, that issues come and go, and they rise or fall in importance on the governor's agenda, and I think Bob knew that too and expressed that too, and that of course turns out to be how it is, one of those jobs. But,
when did you find out that you had the job?
I think I found out only a week or 2 before graduation, and I had been looking at jobs like working for J. Irwin Miller's foundation in Indiana, and I'd been looking at all kinds of other things that would have required us to move and so forth, and I had pretty much assumed that I would not be offered this job for whatever reason. I forget why, but it came as a surprise, but a happy one. As by then I had done some more research on Byrne, and we had a class exercise on school funding issues and formula, property tax equalization, the math of property tax equalization, what we called power equalization in those days, so I had managed to come more up to speed than I was when I interviewed with Bob, and I think it took a couple of months, 6 weeks, something like that.
So when did you actually start in the governor's office?
I guess I started in April, is my best recollection.
Of 74.
Of 74. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what was the office like as you start this new job?
Well, I was in a very peculiar setting, just physically. The special assistant for education to Cahill had been held over, and his name was Dennis Helms, son.
Fairly well-known family.
Son of Richard Helms, yeah, exactly. And
director of the CIA.
Yes. Actually, about to undergo his crisis at that point, or had undergone his. I can't remember. But in any event, Dennis was only too happy to be housed well out of the State House, across the street in one of those, on the second floor of one of those crummy little townhouses. And after all he was trying to do was find another job, and he knew that Governor Byrne wasn't going to be asking him to do much substantive at all. And there was he had his secretary over there, Lynn Muni, but I found it just utterly insane to be, out of the action to that extent, because one of the things I had learned pretty solidly in the mayor's office was the importance of proximity to the decision makers. That if you're staff to these guys, but out of sight, you're out of mind and ineffective. So I kept politely nagging Caden to get me moved across the street, and they didn't have the office was configured, as you may remember, very differently than it is today, and like there was no glass partition making secretary space available in what had been a grand hallway there, right? Also, most importantly, the State House nurse was located right to the side. If you're going to the council's office, the State House nurse was right to the right and had a nice suite of offices right there. And it took Caden and Raymar a few months to oust the State House nurse and banish her to the basement of the State House, into what had been, I think, some kind of storage room. And so then I move in there, young punk. I was 24, 25 at the time. So let's see, this was 74. I was born in 49. I was 25. Just 25. And I come blowing in there, and all of the veterans of the State House really resented me for ousting this gray-haired, grandmotherly State House nurse that had been in there for 30 years. I don't know how long, but she was a beloved person, and you could cut the hatred from some of the old timers there with a knife for a few months. But
how about joining the council's office as a non-lawyer?
Yeah, well, yeah.
I mean, did that create problems?
No, actually, it was Lou's idea to have some non-attorneys in there to do more policy research and not non-legislative work, and I think that idea came from the governor. I'm sure it came from the governor, and I think the idea was a terrific idea. The other people working in the council's office were career attorneys. Many of them just seconded from the Attorney General's office, and a more nonpartisan group you couldn't imagine. And most of them were actually quietly Republican in their political views. Well, moderate to liberal Rockefeller Republican, but still, I don't think a majority of them had voted for Byrne, which didn't matter to Byrne at all, and didn't matter to Lou, as far as I could tell. He was looking for competence in the different sectors, and I came in there as a technical person, as a policy wonk, and joining others who were really policy wonks, with more legal training and maybe less statistics or other tools of the public policy profession. But and they were a little older than me, and they had a lot more experience in this state government, and so we formed good little partnerships, I think. You'd have to ask Art Winkler, who was my closest partner, because he was education, and education was the biggest part of the agenda for the first 18 months or so. And or Judy Nallen, who did healthcare. But I think it worked well. And then we got a second person about a year later, also out of the Woodrow Wilson School. Kathy Heinz, I think, was the second person hired. And so she was able to take on social service kind of stuff, social welfare issues, if I recall correctly, and community planning and that kind of stuff, if I remember right. Then we had a third person for a while, very, very powerful intellect and public administrator par excellence, Jerry Riley. I don't know if you remember Jerry, but he was able to take on the part of the social welfare agenda that had to do with Medicaid, and Medicare, actually, because the state had a role in Medicare reimbursement rates and all that kind of stuff. And I continued working on the sort of healthcare cost containment and finance issues, but in very close partnership with Jerry, in very close partnership with Judy. So it was a kind of three of us working on those issues. And then at some point, about, I think, roughly 18 months into the 3 years that I was there, they asked me to take on this intergovernmental fiscal relations role that was new really to the state government as a policy role, but in partnership with particularly with Marilyn Barry Thompson in Washington, and who
was the head of the New Jersey Washington office.
Right, and an extremely competent, hardworking state representative she was, and she had a staff of 2 or 3, as I remember, and a couple of interns. And but what those offices were in those days were really meant to serve the different departments to make sure that their federal grant applications were moving forward, and in some cases earmarks in the Congress, very rarely, but sometimes there would be an effort to get a piece of legislation that allocated money, or that made a little policy tweak that would permit more money basically through the grant and aid systems that were still flourishing at that time. And they really weren't seen as places where the governor could try to influence bigger magnitude policy questions, such as we didn't even know why we only got 50% or 55% reimbursement on Medicaid when Mississippi was getting 83% or whatever it was, 78%, I think. We had to learn with Marilyn how these formulas worked in great detail, and then try to see if we could figure out how to alter the formulas, or how to get whole new programs passed that would result in benefit to our state, but we knew also probably benefit other states too. And so that pretty quickly led to first very ad hoc coalition building, or issue by issue, with a few other like-minded governors. And the first effort of that kind was in the area of welfare reform. This was in the Ford administration, when Cap Weinberger was the OMB director, if I recall correctly, and was pushing hard for welfare reform, which was really an effort started in the Nixon years. And if you remember, there was an idea of a minimum guaranteed income, and they were really, frankly, trying for that through what was then called a welfare reform effort, and we took a very strong interest in that, along with Governors Milton Schaap, Dan Walker, Milton Schaap of Pennsylvania, Dan Walker of Illinois, and Ella Grasso of Connecticut. And took us a couple of weeks of hard discussion and negotiating to get all these governors to agree on a simple one or two page letter to Cap Weinberger's, setting forth, a couple of 2 or 3 principles of how we wanted to see welfare reform go. I wish I had the letter. It's probably in the archive somewhere. But that was really the beginning of the effort to have the old industrial heartland states act in concert and with aggression on these kind of federal fiscal policy issues, and so that was but think of it. So the job, by the time that change or that addition to my portfolio was made, my job involved elementary and secondary education, including the financing thereof and the reform of the financing thereof, and therefore also included tax reform with a big T and a big R, because it obviously meant getting the income tax passed. Higher education and the reform of financing of higher education. We had a whole process that Ralph Dungan created called a commission headed by Ed Boer, who was chairman of McGraw-Hill, held hearings throughout the state and came up with a whole new system of rationalizing the finance of higher education, and healthcare cost containment, where we were installing the first system of prospective budget review and approval, and trying to toughen up the certificate of need system so that hospitals didn't overcapitalize, basically, themselves. And then, on top of that, I get to get involved in this intergovernmental fiscal relations issue at a time when great changes were going on in that system, and where the state, because it was in such tough shape economically and fiscally, really needed to make sure it was maximizing the flow of federal dollars.
Before we talk more in detail about the issues that you worked on, why don't you describe the structure of the governor's office at that time?
Yeah. Well, that's
to the extent that anyone can describe it.
Well, that's. I mean, it's really simple, and it was really quite wonderful. It was you'd have to count, but it was something like 12 or 13 professionals total, and secretaries. So there was probably approximately one secretary per professional. Most of these were concentrated most of the professional staff was concentrated in the counsel's office. And then there was somebody to do patronage, a chief of staff.
At that time, executive secretary, not titled chief of staff in the first term.
Right, that's right. I'd forgotten that. Thank you. So Don Land was titled executive secretary. And he was chief of staff. He was executive secretary most of the time I was in the governor's office, or all the time. I'm not. Bob might have been coming in as I was exiting, and Bob had been an old friend from, or 3 or 4 year old friend from the Bowen campaign. So I felt really good about his appointment.
That's Bob Mulcahy.
Bob Mulcahy, sorry. And yeah, so there was a chief of staff, or as you say, a governor, executive secretary. There was somebody under him to do patronage and that kind of stuff. Secretaries to each of those people, and the governor, of course. And then there was the legislative office, which was made up of basically two people, Jerry English and Bob Torricelli. And there was a press office of 2 or 3 professionals, and the rest was the counsel's office. And you know, in those days, the tradition was that the people in the governor's office didn't get paid very much, and they were expected to do, you know, sort of have oversight over these vast areas of government, and they were terrific jobs. They were just fantastically good jobs because of the breadth of responsibility for people who were very young, and we were expected to stay out of the newspapers. I mean, that was the tradition, and we were able to stick to that. You know, fast forward to the era of Tom Kane, when I was calling on the governor's office, first to try to make sure that they kept supporting the Northeast Midwest Institute, but then also to see if we couldn't get some bond business for Lehman Brothers, where I'd gone to work after the work in Washington. And the governor's office had started to become pretty large, and you know, I'd have to go upstairs in the State House to find some people that worked for the governor, and quite a distance away, and they were paid multiples of what we had been paid, but they had job descriptions that were way narrower, and there was a lot of hierarchy, particularly in the sort of policy analytic side and so forth. And then fast forward another decade to the Florio administration, and it had become gigantic. And they were paid even more, and they had even less to do, and so on. They were also getting themselves in the papers. I think they felt that in order to just maintain whatever thin slices of responsibility they were being given, they had to, you know, use sharp elbows, and part of that was, they thought, I think in a number of cases, meant getting in the papers and starting to become their own figures, own public figures, and inevitably, I think that led to you know, their own agendas, and you know, there became little fiefdoms within the governor's office and so forth. You know, there was virtually none of that that I witnessed in the Byrne administration. I mean, how can you have a fiefdom when there's only 13 or 15 or 18 people, and when everybody's got way too much to do? The other thing about that small, pretty flat and collegial structure meant that the governor was forced to rely very heavily on his cabinet officers. And as the governor's office grows, the governors are finding they have to rely less and less on their cabinet officers, and come to rely on these sort of supervising cabinet officers. And I think that, you know, there are some positive aspects to that, but mostly negative aspects. I think it slows down the policy process. I think it makes the commissioners less accountable. I think mostly bad results.
You mentioned the lack of hierarchy as a positive in the first term of the Byrne administration. One criticism has been that wasn't quite clear that the roles were as defined as they would become in later years, particularly in terms of the executive secretary's role, which wasn't quite clearly what the chief of staff position became in Governor Burns' second term.
Right.
You want to comment a little bit about that?
Well, I don't have a lot to say about that. I guess I think that that the study of governor's offices and the presidency and big city mayors' offices was all pointing up the fact that these figures with their vast power needed a pretty powerful chief of staff to coordinate the increasingly complicated agendas of the staffs. And so I really think that the whole movement toward strong chiefs of staff probably started with Sherman Adams in the Eisenhower administration, or the modern chief of staff role. I think started, well, probably further back than that in the FDR period, but with his more military background, Eisenhower, I think, had a lot to do with sort of crystallizing the idea of the powerful chief of staff in the White House. And then, of course, when Kennedy came in, there was a lot more of this fluidity and uncertainty that you're talking about with respect to the first Byrne administration. In contrast to the Johnson administration, where Joe Califano was the chief of staff, young and some said inexperienced as he was. Califano sort of reasserted the idea of the strong chief of staff, imposing some degree of discipline on a fairly far-flung executive staff in those years. My sister worked for the Johnson White House, and so I was, I guess, sort of predisposed to the idea of a strong chief of staff. But I have to say, I don't recall lots of actual problems with the less sharply defined executive secretary role. I think Don Land actually kept things flowing and so on. From my perspective, reasonably well, and we were. I remember now that you mention it, I do remember the criticism, but I think a lot of that has to do with a new governor trying to feel his way about how he wanted this thing to operate, and the fact that he hadn't had any prior experience as the chief executive of a pretty big, powerful governmental entity. I mean, his background as a prosecutor and judge didn't really prepare him the way a big city mayor might have been prepared for the chief executive role. So, I don't know that if they'd called Don Land the chief of staff, that anything would have been much different. I think it takes any new office holder time to figure out how they really are comfortable with everything working. And remember that there were two very, very powerful advisors who would not have tolerated the kind of discipline that's usually associated with a chief of staff, even if they had called Don or anybody else the chief of staff, Luke Hayden and Dick Leone. So for policy purposes, those guys would always have constituted the chief staff, the chief of policy staff, I don't think that a clearer definition of the executive secretary's role or renaming that role would have made much difference.
Why don't you describe your recollections of working with both Lou Caden and Dick Leon? Let's start with Lou Caden, who you worked directly for.
Yeah, I worked directly for Lou, and I found him to be still one of the 2 or 3 brightest people that I've ever encountered. And I've been fortunate to work with all kinds of really sharp people. But I think Lou intellectually, sheerly intellectually, was, I think I'd have to say he's still the smartest person I've ever worked with for. Dick Leon, I think, was his intellectual equal. Different kind of intellect, and
different in what way?
Well, I mean, Lou's training and so on was the law, and so his way of thinking about issues was heavily, though not entirely, a lawyer's way of thinking about issues. Leon's was, I would say, more mathematical, more steeped in realpolitik, and frankly less through the lens of legal discipline. But the combination of the two of those guys working on these central issues of our time, still the central issues of our time, was just incredible for some young 25-year-old just graduated from graduate school. Really wet behind. I was the operational definition of wet behind the ears. So, I didn't have lots of direct interaction with Dick Leon. Because I reported to Lou, I was mostly directly interacting with Lou, but often they were together, and there would be meetings of 10 people or so, and they would be. They didn't do a lot of back and forth. I mean, they typically had their act together by the time a meeting would take place. You didn't see a lot of vigorous debate between them at meetings. You knew that some of that debate had taken place before the meetings or sometimes after the meetings because of what you'd hear from your friends who worked directly for Leon, or you'd hear about it from Lou's secretary or something. And you knew that there was a lot of vigorous debate, and they didn't agree on everything, and their different perspectives did lead to a lot of vigorous debate. And there were a few times when the rumors were flying about Lou and Dick being at war and things like that. And I think that was all in the few occasions I can really think of, that proved to be just rumor and staffs jealous of each other or something like that. I think they actually had, from the governor's perspective, in service of the governor, I think they probably had a virtually ideal relationship because it produced, I think, almost every time terrific advice and terrifically well-informed, well-researched advice.
We've heard, however, that perhaps because the strength of their intellect and self-confidence, there was also a perception on the outside,
sure,
among the cabinet and also in the legislature, that there was arrogance within the key
Sure.
sort of units of the administration that led to problems in the legislative program and the like. Would you want to expand on that?
Sure, sure. Let's remember, Lou Caden lived in New York. He was a New Yorker by then, and was driven down every day. So just that alone, that he had turned into this, even though he grew up and ran for Congress from Perth Amboy, he'd become this New Yorker, and he was incredibly young. I can't remember how old he was at the time, but he was like 31 or 33 or something like that, and he never did, and I'm sure doesn't yet, suffer fools kindly, and there's a sense that anybody who can't keep up with him intellectually is going to be treated as a fool. I don't think that was ever true, but I think that was a worry by everybody on the outside who found himself in a room with him. And of course, a lot of this is being a hotshot lawyer. This is the way any really great prosecutor behaves, and any great litigator, particularly, right? And so he brought a lot of that kind of forcefulness to every situation, because that's what lawyers do. I think a lot of this had to do with again, being a very smart, very successful young lawyer. But clearly, it rubbed any number of people and their constituencies the wrong way. Yeah, no question. And you may remember the sort of continuing hoo-ha over his driver and the car. I mean, it was a wonderful Chrysler New Yorker, if I remember right, gray Chrysler New Yorker, right? And that driver of his, whose name is escaping me,
Hobart Flanagan.
Hobart Flanagan, thank you, who had been an ex-con, I think. Look at that up. Or he had been in some degree of trouble somehow, and I think trouble with the law if he hadn't actually served time. I think he had served time. And he had been a boxer or something like that. It's sort of this classic story. And the guy needed a job, and he was a pretty good, loyal driver and stuff. But he became an issue. The car became an issue. And what it was really all about was that Caden had never deigned to move in state and become a New Jerseyan again. And he never did, as far as I remember. Okay, so, I mean, that alone. Okay, then Dick Leone, similarly, brilliant guy, young, impossibly young to be so brilliant, and similar concern about arrogance and so forth. Yeah, it was a problem. I'm sure it was a problem with some key legislators. I'm sure it was a problem with constituencies, particularly probably labor union types and so on. Although, we ended up with great relationships with some of the terrific labor union leaders of New Jersey, like Joel Jacobson and so on. And but guys like Marchianti, I suspect, I didn't witness this directly, but I suspect from moment one, the Caden Leone style would have been a problem for a guy like Charlie Marchianti,
who was the head of the AFL-CIO.
Head of the state AFL-CIO, and who I think both Caden and Leone were suspicious of, just on sort of basic legal cleanliness grounds as much as political grounds.
How much direct contact did you have with Governor Byrne?
I didn't have a lot of direct contact until about the last year or 18 months, except as part of small groups, but virtually no one-on-one, which I think there wouldn't have been a need. My work was always developed and filtered through both art and Lou. And for the first year or so, I wasn't sure the governor knew much about who I was or what I did.
That would have been Art Winkler.
Art Winkler, mm-hmm.
Who was an assistant counsel.
He was assistant counsel. He was older. He was more experienced in the ways of the State House, and you know, he would always get my comments on anything he wrote. I was always getting comments on anything he wrote. But frankly, I'm sure his review was more useful to a piece of paper than my review was to his piece of paper.
And of course, one of the primary roles of the assistant counsels were to monitor legislation moving through the legislature and to advise the governor's council and occasionally the governor himself about committee actions, and when bills were passed, recommend whether the bills would be signed or vetoed or conditionally vetoed.
Right. Yeah, and I never tried to poach on that core responsibility of colleagues like Art or Judy, and I'm glad I didn't, because I mean, that was their core competency and their core responsibility. And I think Judy, because she was less experienced, we had maybe a more maybe she would use me more on the legislative stuff than Art, but not a lot. You remember the key stuff with respect to the education legislation and the tax reform legislation was very much driven by quantitative analytics that I supposedly was able to understand quicker or faster because I'd taken a few more courses of the right kind in graduate school. I mean, in reality, we all were learning it together pretty much at the same time.
Let's explore that in more depth. You joined midway during the first year of the administration, I guess, roughly.
Well, yeah, sort of the first third, by the end of the first third.
And already the administration is immersed, if not overwhelmed, by the school issue forced upon it.
I wouldn't say overwhelmed. I mean, I think that, but close to overwhelmed, maybe. Yeah.
But in any event, the administration has decided early in the governor's first year in office that what was thought to be a pledge during a campaign, that he didn't see the need for an income tax, quote, in the foreseeable future, close quote, had to be abandoned, and that the administration was going to support an income tax to meet the Supreme Court's decision in Robinson v. Cahill. What was the sort of mood in the office as you joined, and what sort of responsibilities did you have on the school issue?
Well, as I recall, the decision to seek an income tax had already been made by the time I arrived, and but I don't think it had been officially made and announced by the time I interviewed. So I was tracking this real carefully from up the street in Princeton, and I had seen precisely the same dynamic out in Wisconsin with Pat and Lucy, and so it was, for me, no surprise at all. I don't think it was any surprise or disappointment or anything to any of the other professionals in the office. I mean, I think that it was preordained, and people believed that it was preordained. So I don't think there was any impact on negative impact on morale or anything. If anything, it was probably positive because finally we could just pursue the correct path without any shilly-shallying. I mean, that's my memory. It was a long time ago.
Do you think it was a mistake for Brendan Byrne to utter those foreseeable future words during the campaign?
It's interesting. I wasn't that. I wasn't following the campaign all that closely because, remember, I lived in New York. I was commuting down to Princeton just a couple of days a week and hadn't really been all that watchful about this campaign. I was trying to get through graduate school and keep doing the consulting gigs in New York, and so I don't really have a feel for whether it was a mistake or not. He was not the only politician at the state level who felt forced to make that promise and then break it. So it wasn't out of character with what was going on in other hard-pressed state governments that needed to reform their school funding system for constitutional reasons. So I don't want to. I don't know if it was a mistake or not. I just don't know.
Do you recall what the first assignments you were given as you joined the staff?
Yeah. My first focus was as much on the development of a regulatory system, a new regulatory system for the Department of Education, as it was on the intricacies of the formula. Yes, I had to familiarize myself with the various alternatives for the formula, power equalization formula, but fact is that that's pretty simple stuff. And the people from the Department of Ed and the Treasurer's Office were on top of that stuff pretty well, as was Art, frankly. What Lou felt he needed more staffing on initially was the thorough and efficient regulatory system being developed by the Department of Ed people like Bill Shine in particular was in charge of that. And it was a scheme that was designed to force all school districts to set goals and objectives in a sort of loosely defined process, and to basically to impose good management, impose a system of good management, which meant planning and setting objectives, and then seeing if you'd met the objectives and altering the plan to do better next time. It's sort of the basic planning model of that period, being tailored and imposed on the school districts. It was considered cutting edge within the field of educational management at the time, and but there was a strong concern in the governor's office about how this was going, and the constituencies out there, particularly the teachers and the supervisory associations, and to some extent the local government interest groups, were all concerned about how this was going to be and how much it was going to impinge on local self-determination and strong local control and all that. And in the governor's office, and particularly the treasurer's office, the opposite concern, or almost the opposite concern, which was that it was too soft in a form of accountability, particularly if it was the only system of regulatory accountability that was being put together to accompany the reforms in the finance side. And the strong feeling out of the Treasurer's office that I shared to some extent that we ought to be looking for ultimate outcome measures, i.e. test scores. But there was a hesitation on all our parts in the State House to force that issue on, or force that view on Burke and his staff, because there was a lot of legitimate concern about the quality of testing, the cultural neutrality or lack of neutrality of testing, also coming to the fore in the field of education at that time. And I do remember that the strongest, most adamant advocate of imposing, some kind of test score-driven objective system was Cliff Goldman.
Deputy Treasurer.
That Deputy Treasurer. And, I think that, so that probably was the most interesting part that I got to be sort of the point person on in the governor's office. That stuff. The finance, the mathematics of the finance and all that kind of stuff was something I participated in, but I didn't feel a lot of personal ownership. But I had a lot more personal ownership about the T&E, what was called the T&E regulatory system, or we had some further name, some further word in there. You have to go back to the archive. But and then the next thing was to start to understand what the Department of Health was up to in the area of hospital cost containment. And there really wasn't anybody in the governor's office that felt like they had the time to focus on that and had the sort of broad policy training to quickly get on top of that.
Before you move to health, did you get involved in the school debate in the legislature with any direct contact with legislators?
Oh, yeah, I should say that one of the great pleasures, I mean, it was interesting listening to Bill Rivera talk about one of his surprising, pleasurable experiences was finding what a fabulous bunch of people the legislators were in the modern period. Well, I had the same reaction when I started to get to know Steve Wiley and Al Burstein particularly, and then guys like on the other side of the aisle like Wayne Dumont and so on. That this was a legislature made largely of people who were there not because it was a great job, but because it was their duty. They felt that it was their duty to be there and privileged to be there, and a real enjoyment of the substance of the policy issues that they were struggling with, despite the fact that the state fiscally and economically was hurting tremendously, and that they were worried about the state's capacity, just fiscal capacity, to see a clear way past the Robinson case and so on, and the Supreme Court mandate. So yeah, and then also there were very gifted legislative staffers that Art and I got to know very well, and one of them turns out to live a block from me in Montclair on Grove Street, and has for 20 years, Bob Noonan. But there were 2 or 3 others who were just as good at what they were doing as Art and I and the people in the Treasurer's office, the people down the block at the Department of Ed were. And it was a great pleasure to be working with those guys. And there was never any appreciable antipathy. We were all trying to find a way to get a practical political solution to a very complex, challenging problem in a very difficult period for the state economically. I mean, that's one of the things people don't like to remember, that we actually managed, all of us, to get something done that was very significant, despite a really horrendous period of structural economic difficulty.
With unemployment at the highest level since the Depression. And
unemployment highest level since the Depression, a complete change in the economy, in the nature of the economy itself, moving from heavy industry to something we weren't sure what. Services hadn't taken off. Nothing had taken off. We were just losing jobs in the industrial sectors, and it wasn't clear that we were going to be replacing them anything like one-to-one or dollar for dollar in this sort of hazily defined light industry and service sectors. And we were feeling our way in the economic development area way more than we were feeling our way in the educational funding and healthcare and these other arenas. So there was always this really enormous anxiety on everybody's shoulders about how are we going to afford whatever solution we come up with politically for the school aid formula or for the hospital system or whatever. And the ability of all these parties to figure it out, despite this overhanging anxiety, has always been, to me, the real distinguishing feature of the Byrne administrations. But I've started to come to think that maybe it's because of that really dark economic outlook that people were able to get beyond their parochial interests enough to make real sacrifices, like Wayne Dumont did, for instance. But I'm not sure that's correct either. But the fundamental economic setting is something that we really need to remind the current generation. I mean, the state right now is just rolling in it, and it's been rolling in it since Second Keyn, basically. It's never seen the kind of fiscal stress that we saw, and yet they've been able to do less to actually change policy and do better for people. It's an enduring mystery to me.
of course, that effort in the first year of the administration falls just short of getting approved in the legislature. What was?
Well, we got our tax bill passed, and we got.
But not in the first year.
Yeah. Oh, not in the first year. Sir, sorry, I thought you said term. Sorry.
No, first year.
No, it took us six bills, didn't it? I think.
Whatever. Do you remember what the mood was in the office when you lost the vote during the first year?
Oh yeah, I mean, for a day or two, it was. I mean, we lost several votes in the first year, certainly the first and second years, and there would always be this kind of, oh, geez, like losing a campaign, like losing a political campaign. I was rather well experienced losing a political campaign, and because you always go into a political campaign, as we did with those votes that we lost, those first 5 votes, I think, believing you're going to win. You can't conduct a campaign for anything, a candidate or an issue, without believing you're going to win, right? And so you convince yourself you're going to win, and then you lose, and you feel terrible for a few days. Then you pick yourself up and you keep going. Somebody has a new idea. Well, we're going to get Lynch's vote this way, or we're going to get Lynch out of the hospital to be able to vote this time. And then you gear yourself back up, or you have a new idea. Like, the idea of the rebate was one of those ideas that in the early editions of the tax bill was nowhere to be found. The way I remember this, which is I'm sure overly simplified by the press of decades, but the way I remember this is that particularly in the governor's office, somebody, probably Kevin Sullivan in the treasurer's office, and or his wife, even then at the time, Kathy Sullivan, and Jeff Laurenti, a classmate of mine from the Woodrow Wilson School, who by then was working for Joe Merlino.
Senator Merlino.
Senator Merlino, the head of this. What position was Joe in? Was he the head of the Senate?
Senate President.
He was the president of the Senate, yeah. So Jeff Laurenti as Joe Merlino's chief aide. This group of 3 or 4 of us were continuing to say you got to have a rebate of some kind so that people see that you're not just taking money away from me, you're equalizing the system. And you can't rely on reductions in local property taxes from increased school aid to make that clear to people. You've got to show them directly what the state government is doing, if only in a semi-symbolic way, because that's how Pat Lucy pulled it off in Wisconsin. And slowly more people came to believe that was the price. It wasn't. I mean, the earlier pieces of the earlier attempts to pass a tax package didn't have that, because it was really somewhat inefficient government to do this sort of circular thing with money. And we just kept saying, well, look, it was the only way Pat Lucy could get a similar state, a similar makeup in the legislature and so on, to pass an income tax and do some property tax equalization. And slowly more and more people kind of came on board with that. I regret to tell you on this public record that I was not the person to think of splitting the rebate into 2 parts, one that came just before the primary and the second just before the general election. That was Laurenti, I'm pretty sure. I don't know if he'd cop to it, but I wish I had thought of that. I wish I had.
He's due for an interview, another interview,
well,
so we'll ask him.
So the first interview didn't cover that?
No.
Definitely going to have to ask him that. If Don forgets, you're going to remember it, right?
Now, in the next year, the tax issue again percolates up, but the strategy seems to be a little bit different. The legislature seems to be taking more of a upfront role. Was that your perception, that they were really upfront, or was it more a sort of collegial or a conspiratorial agreement between the governor's office and the legislature, that the Byrne administration had been hurt during the first year, and that it would be more effective if the legislature itself looked as the initiator of the new package?
Yeah, I mean, I think the latter. I don't think that it was ever all that unplanned. So yeah, I think that it was a loose understanding that. But I mean, there was also some real warfare going on between the governor's office and elements in the legislature, particularly Pat Dodd, referred to widely in the council's office, at least, as the Prince of Darkness.
Who was the senator from Essex County.
The senator from Essex County held, he thought, a swing vote, and was perceived, at least by us, to be a very The
second round of the tax fight.
Okay.
And I think you agreed that the legislature sort of went out a little more out front, publicly at least, in terms of taking the initiative on proposing a new tax package. But it sounds like in fairly close consultation with the governor's office and the administration.
Yeah, well, certainly at the staff level, there was never a period when there wasn't close consultation with legislative staff and the governor's counsel's office, and as far as I recollect, with the treasurer's office, and to a lesser extent, but always continuing with the State Department of Education, because the formula was always one of the key variables, and so there was this constant interplay on the technical issues, particularly surrounding the formula, of course, but also surrounding how the tax component would work and whether there would be a rebate and all that kind of stuff. So I don't ever remember a period when we were out of touch, at least at the staff level.
Any anecdotes you recall of meetings with staff or legislators?
No, not really. I mean, it was almost daily in a lot of cases. We were in and out of each other's offices that frequently and regularly, or irregularly, but frequently, you know. And the relationship had always been cordial and collaborative, and so you don't tend to remember anything but dramatic moments, and there weren't. I don't recall dramatic things, dramatic fights or epiphanies. We were just sort of day to day in the trenches of the discussion, and occasionally there would be a delay getting results from the latest computer simulations of a formula change or a change in the way the tax would work, and everybody would get upset that the computer guys were taking so long to get you the printouts back. But that was sort of the most dramatic problems that we had at the staff level, were things like that. So no, I don't really recollect a sort of standout meeting because everything was pretty collegial and, like I say, flat. There wasn't a lot of the hierarchy that came into being either in the legislative staff or the executive staff in subsequent administrations. I think a lot of the dramatic things that happen in government, particularly dramatic bad things that happen in government, fights and so on, happen because of too many cooks in the kitchen and too much hierarchy. And so people start to block other people from access to information and things like that. In this period, I recollect it as a period when information flowed very freely and as quickly as the computers would permit it to flow, and there was very little effort to sequester information and use information as power in the debates. I think subsequent administrations, subsequent legislative leaderships, allowed that to come into play because there were just way more people than you could manage without hierarchy and the problems that come with hierarchy. So.
Now, you said that one of the areas that you focused on during your first year on the staff was the extent of state oversight and regulatory sort of review of school district performance and accountability.
Right. And that continued as a big, serious issue in the second year, too, for sure.
We'll expand on that. How did it finally get resolved? To your satisfaction, or did you think it was too weak or too strong?
I ended up feeling that it was about right from the standpoint of what we were trying to achieve with respect to changing management and leadership behavior by superintendents and principals. But I did end up feeling that it should have also had a component that relied on test scores for achievement of output, true output-based measures of how successful you were at achieving school reform. I thought that it should have both, and it really ended up just having the one. So yeah, I felt that that it should have been stronger, and that we should have really taken on Fred Burke on this issue more strongly.
In later years, there was criticism that there were too many forms, too many requirements that the state imposed on the districts, and it was diverting time. Too
much process stuff and so forth. And by then, I was working in the early and mid-'80s at Lehman Brothers for a guy who was the president, the long-serving president of his school board in, I think it was Pequannock. And so he would give me chapter and verse how too much paperwork and so on that there was, and I don't have any reason to doubt him. I think that if Bill Shire had stayed as deputy commissioner for that area, he might have been able to implement it with less of that kind of bureaucratic nonsense. And I think the bureaucratic nonsense grew over time, but I'm sure that there's justice in that criticism, yeah.
Now, you've mentioned a few times Fred Burke, the Commissioner of Education.
Yep.
Talk more about your contacts with him and also the sort of outside world's perception of Fred Burke.
Yeah, very complicated. That entails a lot of complicated stuff. I'll try to be fairly summary in this. First of all, you had to respect Fred Burke's resume, and his experience and academic preparation and so on. But I experienced him as a very smart guy who was able to use a lot of that preparation, a lot of that prior experience to make good policy judgments in most part. But I felt that he was just not doing a good job with managing his relationships, either within the Department of Education or certainly with respect to Leon, Caden, and I'm less clear on how he was when he managed to get one-on-one with the governor, but I think that this was one cabinet officer that I had the impression that the governor didn't want to spend much time directly with, whereas I think he welcomed one-on-one time with Dungan, one of my other responsibilities.
Who was Chancellor of Higher Education.
And who had been a ambassador to Chile, and who had had lots of other experience that trains you in how to manage your relationships with decision makers.
Do you feel that Fred Burke was confrontational, or was it a personality issue?
I guess, I don't think he had full mastery of his emotions, and was prone to angry outbursts and more open frontal sharing of his frustrations and so on than was good for maintaining productive relationships with legislators and lobbyists and people on our end of State Street and so on. He was going through turbulent times in his marriage, as I remember, or had just been through a turbulent time in his marriage, and family relations were unsettled, I seem to remember, and we thought that maybe some of this was just because he was under a lot of personal pressure, but slowly, in whatever the source of the problem, there became a wider and wider spread recognition that it was a problem that wasn't going to go away, and was limiting his effectiveness.
Of course, one of the relationships that became highly contentious was the one with Bob Braun, the education reporter at the time for the Star-Ledger, who became a highly visible critic of Fred Burke as an administrator, and also perhaps a personal style.
Yeah.
Did that undermine the administration's attempts to implement its educational program?
Yeah, I think it probably did. It's so much time has passed that I've forgotten all the ins and outs of that. But I remember a number of occasions, without a lot of specificity, but a number of occasions where we in the governor's office would read Brown's column, and an apparent problem would be highlighted with his usual histrionics in the column. But it was the same kind of histrionics you'd find in any kind of crusading columnist's writing. And so, you'd always haircut the reality by 50 or 75%. But that didn't mean that there wasn't something significant in the column. And then we would talk with the chancellor, with the commissioner, or one of the deputy commissioners or assistants, and say, well, what do you guys think about this, and what do you think needs to be done about it? And all we'd get back often was just anger about Braun and what a bad guy he was, and so on. And I mean, he was pretty out there as a journalist, but he wasn't, over the line into unforgivable journalistic behavior. And his heart was clearly in the right place in terms of worrying about the kids and worrying about the parents and poverty and education and how the cities were going, which was uniformly terrible. So, yeah, we were, at first it was almost amusing to see Burke's lack of ability to deal with them, but it quickly became more than amusing. It became a concern because we really worried that it was a blind spot. His reaction to Braun made it impossible for him to see the kernel, or maybe several kernels, of truth in whatever Braun was writing, and then made it less likely for us to be able to respond with some kind of useful, forward-moving response. I mean, I think the press is a great source of information for a governor to know what's really going on out there, because like FDR trained us all to understand, you need many sources of information. It's like intelligence gathering, and the more sources, the more likely you are to get a complete mosaic of the reality out there. And so I think our attitude toward the press was basically they're helpful at helping us understand what the hell's going on. And Burke clearly didn't have that view and was just so angry at Braun personally that he couldn't bring himself to see it as useful. He just saw it as useless or worse.
Did you and other members of the administration who were dealing with education issues and policy also feel somewhat undermined when you would read in the Star-Ledger through Braun's reporting topics that you thought you should have been advised of before he learned about them?
Yeah, sometimes. Yeah. Yeah. And so sometimes when we'd call down to the Ed department, there was an edge in our voice. Hey, why didn't you tell us that test scores were plummeting off the charts low, or whatever it was? I think that often and increasingly we came to worry about that.
Was there discussion of replacing Braun?
Of replacing Burke?
Burke, I'm sorry.
There was discussion of
Probably
replacing Braun every hour, but
it,
right. No, but replacing Burke, yeah. I think there was. I was not directly privy to it, though. But we heard there was. Yeah, we heard there was. And this was before the days of the. Did he have a fixed term by then? No, there was no fixed term by then.
Well, the income tax and the school reform package does finally pass in the summer with the aid of the Supreme Court's.
Right. The summer of
75.
75, yeah.
With the aid of the Supreme Court's order closing the schools as of July 1st.
Right.
Schools were closed for a few days in the middle of the summer.
Right. Had no impact at all.
What do you recall of the mood in the governor's office and among the other sort of key people on the issue at the time?
At the time that we finally got it passed?
Right.
The sixth, I swear this was the sixth package. Oh, it was a wonderful feeling, for a few days. But then, okay, now how are we going to get this implemented well? How are we going to get it funded? How do we get the formula funded? And as you know, that was the great failure of the later years of that formula, that it just never kept it anywhere near fully funded. If it had been, we wouldn't be in the fix we are today from just school funding equity standpoint, I don't think. But
well, again, with the benefit of so much hindsight over the years, any other mistakes in terms of the policy or the Supreme Court decision that have haunted New Jersey over the many years with the school finance issue?
I think the inability to take on the unions, or unwillingness to take on the unions, and this wasn't just a mistake of our administration or something, it was a mistake of state government leadership from time immemorial that continues to this day. But when I ended up serving on a school board finally in 1990 in Montclair and discovered that we were one of only a handful, maybe 2 states, that still had tenure for administrators. I came to believe that was insane, and that it was a terrible mistake for our administration and every other administration not to have gotten rid of tenure for administrators long ago. Because where the rubber meets the road in education is at the level of the principals, and a little less directly the assistant superintendents and the superintendent. The idea that a superintendent cannot easily change principals, fire principals who are clearly not cutting the mustard as leaders and managers of their schools, is just outrageous. And I think it's still part of state law that that they can have tenure. And now, so I have always considered that a major problem in education in New Jersey, and I've always considered, and companion to that is that I wish we had sustained an effort to make good managers and leaders out of that level of the education administrative net, as they finally started to do in New York with the Carolyn Kennedy funded, privately funded initiative that has come into play under the Bloomberg administration. But the thorough and efficient regulatory framework that we started should have evolved into, better and better training interaction with that level of administrators that makes all the difference in terms of the quality of education. And there never seemed to be a sustained effort to do that. And so I think that, for me, is another companion kind of failure. Yeah.
Did the courts focus on spending and dollar equivalency as a measure of equalization also sort of drive up New Jersey's costs, and in retrospect didn't have the impact on educational improvement that was expected?
Yeah, I mean, again, maybe so. I don't know for sure. Certainly the Abbott decision, I think, can more clearly or more directly be hammered with that critique than the Robinson v. Kale decision. But and then there was a decision, I'm thinking, in the early part of the Whitman administration, one of the Republican administrations, to raise the level of entry teacher salary to a floor substantially above the average entry level teacher salary that had been prevailing before. And it was just such a beautiful, easy play for whatever administration was doing that. It didn't even cost the state very much, because by then the localities were back at like 80% of the average or whatever. So, and I just considered that insane. And if you want a really direct driver of what was going on there, with driving up, I would put that decision way more as a way more influential driver than the general court mandates. But certainly Abbott, I mean, and I think this decision I'm talking about teacher salaries, entry-level salaries, came about at roughly the same time as the Abbott decision, possibly.
Well, there was also legislation, I believe, in the Kane administration that set minimums.
Okay, maybe it was Kane. So, but I consider that to have been just an obvious and direct driver. You know.
What about other approaches during the?
Oh, yeah, well, and the other thing that of course drove costs so heavily was the relaxation of the caps. Caps are just fantastically difficult to maintain and administer fairly. You know, at some point we really lost the gumption to try, and again, my boss at Lehman Brothers was you know, from a very wealthy district, and was making the case that, you know, districts really ought to be allowed to spend up to what they think their client populations want them to deliver in terms of educational services, and else you'll have white flight from the districts that or just flight by people of means from all the other districts that where you didn't also have a racial tone. Because I come from Montclair, and white flight was a deep worry, and was helping us drive through our caps while I was on the board, and I supported that. So this is pretty complicated. These influences are pretty complicated to parse out, I think.
During the legislative debate over the tax packages in 1974 and 75, there was also some support for a statewide property tax.
Yes.
And I think even a bill introduced.
Yeah. That's right. There was a bill introduced. I'd forgotten that. Mm-hmm.
Again, in retrospect, would that been a more effective approach?
Well, I think something that bold is still going to be the only really effective long-term approach, because you will always have pressures in later years to not fully fund whatever equalization aid formula you put in place. So you're always going to face these cyclical movements unless you do something radical enough with the tax base, like a statewide property tax or a region, you know, very large defined region-wide property tax system. And I remember us being quite interested, as more as academics than as practitioners, though, at the time that the bill was being discussed, and I guess it was actually introduced. I'm trying to think who would have introduced it. Do you
I believe
recall?
it's Senator Russo. Maybe.
Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah, John Russo,
Yeah.
right? That makes sense. And you know, we were very interested in what the Hawaii experience seemed to be telling us about a simply, you know, one big unified state school system.
We'll talk more about that. Again, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, would approaching the school problem more on a geographical governance basis, either a statewide system or county-based systems, where the suburbs would be linked with the poorer cities, either statewide or within their counties, have been better to try to get public support for overall reform?
I think it was a non-starter. given the history of New Jersey, you can do things like that in the southern and western states because the Civil War wiped out the legacy of strong home rule in the South, and the West was recently enough developed as states to be able to put in much larger aggregations of local governance, basically strong county or cities that were allowed to keep annexing as they grew. But we considered it a practical impossibility in New Jersey, and I think we were probably right. I mean, we had quite a lot of work being done by the Musto Commission and others on trying to rationalize and rationalize roles among the levels of government and so on. But to really overthrow, in a revolutionary sense, overthrow the system of local control, local governance, is what it would have taken. And the politics, we barely had enough politics to do what we did do in the way of a pretty modest school equalization, property tax equalization, power equalization system, and so on. I mean, it took us six shots to just do that. But to change the governance system of the state in a sweeping a fashion as would make any real difference, I mean, we didn't kid ourselves about whether we had the stroke to do that.
How much was race a factor in making it a political impossibility in New Jersey?
Oh, I'm sure. Well, particularly with hindsight, particularly having seen the racial issue up close and personal in Montclair, it had a great deal to do with it. But even if race hadn't been an issue at all, or had been only half as powerful an issue as it really was, I still don't think we would have had the stroke to be able to do anything about this, because as Bill Libera has said, other people have said, people are incredibly invested in their school system. And their parents were, and their grandparents were, and there is this fantastically strong tradition of that in not just New Jersey, but the entire old industrial heartland, or the old governmental heartland. Certainly the original 13 colonies, and then the Midwest too, pretty strongly. I mean, I grew up in Elmhurst and Lake Forest, Illinois, and the pride in Lake Forest's system of public school system was so strong that when my parents moved us to Bethesda, Maryland, Montgomery County schools, they didn't think that the Montgomery County schools were going to be good enough for me. Montgomery County schools. I would have gone to Bethesda Chevy Chase High School or Walt Whitman High School. But my parents, this boy's been educated in North Shore Chicago schools, and we're just not comfortable enough with Montgomery County, Maryland schools. So I went to a Quaker school in Washington because they were worried I wasn't doing as well as I should on my math. And, that's how people, and my parents are among the best educated, most rational, objective people on the planet. But they made an entirely irrational decision when it came to, little Tommy and his troubles with math. So So I think I understand this, and I think I understand how powerful it is, even without the racial question. And then the power of race in American life is fantastically strong in addition.
You started a while back to talk about another issue, healthcare cost containment,
Yeah.
which was solved during the Byrne administration.
Oh yeah, we got right on top of that one and
But
cleaned that one up.
like school finance reform still is front and center both nationally
Absolutely.
and in New Jersey.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Talk about the experience back then on getting the state regulatory role
Yeah.
in healthcare cost containment.
Yeah, well, that was really a fascinating second area of public policy that I really knew very little about until I arrived in my job and started working with Joanne Finley, the Commissioner of Health, and her very talented deputy commissioners that were working away on this, and we managed to install I think the country's second or third prospective budget approval and per diem rate regulation system. And for a time, a fairly long time in terms of the way the healthcare system has evolved, it was pretty effective at holding down hospital costs in New Jersey compared to other states that didn't have this system. So in that sense, yeah, we did actually accomplish quite a lot with that for a time. And then the state, after I left, the state in the second administration installed an even more interesting and ambitious and cutting-edge system that came to be known as the DRG system, that regulated rates based on the nature of the care and the treatment regime, the diagnosis of the patient, and again, certainly not perfect, and it certainly didn't last forever as an effective means of control, but for a time it was more effective than most other states' systems. A lot of it was based on the Maryland experience and the Canadian experience of that period, as I remember. And Joanne Finley, I think, never got the credit that she deserved for this work, which was really a lot of pioneering work in the field of public administration that was pretty unfamiliar to most people. And are you going to be interviewing Joanne?
Yes.
I hope so. Good, good. Joanne took a lot of knocks because she had to go up against the Hospital Administrators Association, which was and the nursing home crowd, and they were then, and I don't know if they still are, but then I would say they were the most aggressive and vicious interest groups in the state, particularly the Nursing Home Association at that time. But so she was having to really do battle, and it was very vitriolic, the stuff that she faced. More, I would say, way more vitriolic than what was going on the educational front, for either the substantive part of education or the financial part, or the and approached the vitriol of the tax fight, you know. But she was having to face this day in, day out throughout her time in government, and she was not a television-ready type of commissioner. She was a extremely smart public administrator, but she had nobody to box out front for her who was telegenic or who was better at dealing with the slings and arrows that these people on the from the associations were throwing at her, and it was unremitting and often really vicious.
Another area that you mentioned briefly before was higher education.
Yeah, well, and there's a third commissioner entirely different from the other two, and I got reasonably close personally with Dungan. Dungan did that. Dungan made an effort to get to know the young folks in the governor's office, the treasurer's office, and he had us over for like sort of salon seminar kinds of things at his house in Princeton, and all his kids were running around and everything. But it was I mean, he was a very good intellectual himself, could hold his own with a Dick Leone in his area of expertise, and Luke Hayden, and was engaging and funny, and it was also part of his professional demeanor. There was no difference between his personal and his professional demeanor, and he was he built that higher education system, I thought, very smartly. I thought that was a terrible decision later on, what it was, the Kane administration to Whitman administration, to wipe out the department. I don't think we'd be in the trouble we're in with UMDNJ if the department hadn't been wiped out. I don't think we'd be in trouble with some other elements of the higher education system if that hadn't been done. I think that was a really dumb decision. Now Susan Cole, who I've come to know, is the president of Montclair State University, absolutely vociferously disagrees with me, and what she's done with the freedom that she's had up there at MSU is admirable, and I'm proud to be in this community with the same name. Nonetheless, I think that more damage was done than good, the system has very little coordination now. There's a lot of duplication and a lot of holes. All the kinds of things that Ralph inveighed against and so on. So, and then to see what's happened with UMDNJ without adequate oversight from the sponsoring state government is just, it makes me sick. Yeah. I mean, I was in the governor's office when Stan Bergen was building UMDNJ, doing it right, with Ralph Dungan's strong oversight, which is the way it's supposed to be. And I just can't believe that this would have happened if we had a chancellor of higher education with enough staff to maintain some considerable degree of oversight and some control.
Any issues you recall about the relationship with Rutgers, who at that time had a very strong presence at Blaustein? Yeah,
Blaustein, there was a lot of tension between Blaustein and Dungan, and Blaustein resented, as far as I recall, the oversight that Dungan kept trying to apply with limited success to Blaustein, and Blaustein had managed to establish his own relationship directly with the governor and directly with the key legislative leadership, and so was able to work around Dungan and his staff most of the time successfully. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's some mix of both, because Blaustein didn't, in any in any serious way misuse that. He used it generally for good, for building Rutgers generally in the right way as a high quality state university. So I don't think much damage really came from that. But look at the damage that came from having the wrong kind of leadership operating with no oversight of the professional kind in UMD&J's case. It's horrendous.
Now, you mentioned that intergovernmental finance became a focus later in your tenure in the governor's office.
Somewhere in the second year, after we passed the income tax and things were settling down in elementary and secondary education, Caden marched me into his office, and there was Rich Keevy, who I don't think was head of the budget shop. I think he was deputy, and some other people, and they said, we really got to get a handle on all these intergovernmental fiscal flows. We don't think we're getting our fair share at the basic macro level, and we've got this. As I remember, the specific subject of the first meeting, where I was just kind of brought in out of the blue, had to do with the federal transportation budget and the role of the Regional Plan Association and some federal legislation strengthening the hand of the Regional Plan Association, and did we think that was a good idea? And then within 20 minutes it morphed into other areas of intergovernmental fiscal relations that I had never heard of, never thought about, and then gradually the job became more and more of those issues and less, particularly of elementary and secondary education. The healthcare stuff continued pretty much apace throughout the 3 years, and then I had one other issue which you haven't mentioned, and I'm amazed because we're looking into the eye of a TV camera here. I was supposed to worry about New Jersey's failure to have any TV stations in the state, and to try to figure out how to hammer Channel 13 into honoring its obligations as a Newark licensed entity, and somehow that ended up morphing into occasional concerns that the people at New Jersey Television Network, NJN, were out of control, and were saying things about the government that they shouldn't ought to be saying. They were just doing good independent journalism, but there was enough thin skin somewhere in the office that that kept coming up as a motif. Got to get these guys under control. So, but that was the other thing I got to work on. It was kind of a fun issue, but I had spent a summer between my first and second year in graduate school working at Channel 13, so I actually knew a fair amount about how it worked, and Jay Island, who ran it, and stuff like that. I wish I'd had a chance to work more on the television issues, actually. They really were important and interesting, and we really just didn't have time to properly get on top of those issues. But,
Is the television coverage of New Jersey less important now with cable and the multiplicity of channels?
I think we're in the same boat we always were. We are always shortchanged. No, I don't think that the multiplicity of cable access and all that kind of stuff has made more than a tiny bit of difference in this. I just think that and even having Channel 9 in Secaucus hasn't really done much either. We had that happened after I left, and we'd had high hopes that that would make a difference if it came off. But I, as a resident of northern New Jersey, who never watches Channel 9 and doesn't know anybody else who watches Channel 9 news, I can't say that that's made much difference either. We are in a funny position here in New Jersey, and I think we're always going to be.
Well, unless there are other issues you want to talk, I wanted to bring you back to the politics after the passage of the income tax.
Yeah, look, I think that something terribly important has changed since you and I served in government, and that is that people in elected office have turned into careerists. And I think this has happened at in many cases at the local level, certainly at the state level, and very, very fundamentally at the federal level. Because remember, I've been able to work at all three levels of government, and the change in Washington is even more extreme than the change in state government is more extreme than the change in local government. But I think we are now being disserved by a class of elected officials that are in it for the job and in it for the money. And I think we were fortunate enough in our period in government to work with a legislature that there might have been a few guys that were in it for the money and a couple that were undoubtedly corrupt, but most of them were not in it for the money or even in it for what the next step could be. They were in it to serve the public, and because they enjoyed it. And I think that that's what made it possible for Wayne Dumont to step outside his normal party comfort zone. I think it's what made both Wiley and Burstein able somehow to find the time and the energy to devote to the issue of school funding reform and school reform itself, and what makes it difficult or impossible for most of the current crop to do that. We've really, this is a tectonic change, I think, and it's I think it explains a lot about why we were able to accomplish as much as we were able to accomplish despite incredibly difficult fiscal economic circumstances, and why this crowd, this current crowd, whatever the party, hasn't been able to accomplish anything like what we were able to, despite incredibly good economic and fiscal times. That's my thesis, at least.
Now, after the income tax and the school package was enacted, Governor Burns' poll ratings plummet.
I believe they were 17% the day I walked out of the office in like April of '77. Yeah.
Well, what did you feel personally, and what did you sense in the mood of the governor's office as the governor's political prospects approached such a low level?
Well, I had my doubts whether he could be reelected, and which was one of the reasons I was so quick to go down to Washington. We were 6 weeks away from our first child's birth, and it wasn't a really convenient time to move and so on. But certainly the opportunity down there was terrific. But also, I wasn't all that sanguine about having a job in Trenton longer than another 8 or 10 months. But I was actually pretty optimistic when I put my analytic hat on, and I was fortunate enough to actually have put my analytic hat on in partnership with Bob Torselli. After hours, with absolutely no work done during hours, we were very, very strictly adhering to what we thought the appropriate standard was in those days. And by this time, Alan Handler was our counsel, my boss, and even if Bob and I hadn't felt strongly about this, Alan certainly did. So all this work was done after 6 o'clock at night and stuff. But I ended up writing a policy a policy memo saying here are the issues that I think you need to emphasize in your campaign. And I'm a good Trinitarian, so it was 3 issues, and it was education and jobs and transportation or something. Certainly education and jobs. And you need to simplify your message, and I did this amazing amount of analysis of the Eagleton poll results of the last 5 years, from before Brendan had come into office and so on. And I found a lot of inspiration in the poll numbers about the issues. And Bob, at the same time, was writing a memo about where to get the votes, county by county, and how the issues that I was writing up should play in the counties. And it's an interesting sort of not a close collaboration, but sort of a loose collaboration. And there are some people who have cited those 2 memos as having been important in securing the guy's election. I don't think that's right. I think that they were just describing conditions that actually, with maybe some message shaping and so forth, were there to be able to win. And of course, Jeff Laurenti's wonderful idea of splitting the property tax rebate into 2 parts, one 6 weeks before the primary and one 4 weeks before the general, whatever it was. I may be off by a week or 2. But I mean, what a brilliant stroke, and not illegitimate, because the whole point of the exercise was to demonstrate concretely to the folks what the state government was doing to make for a more equitable system of financing, and to ensure that. Other people have criticized it as being sort of somehow illegitimately political, but I don't.
Most analysts have said that Brendan Byrne would not have been renominated in 1977 except for the number of the opponents splitting the anti-Byrne vote.
Yeah, that was also very helpful. that gave me a lot of pleasure.
Do you have any thoughts as to why the anti-Byrne candidates couldn't get together and sort of narrow the field?
They were in the Democratic Party. Will Rogers said, "I don't belong to any organized political party. I'm a Democrat." That was one of the truest, hilarious things he ever said. And the weaker the governor was perceived to be, the more likely it was that a multiplicity of candidates would come into being, would come out of the woodwork to run against him. And so it has this kind of elegant almost Deus ex machina quality to it, doesn't it? And you hear the same story all over the country all the time. You know. But I also don't think he would have prevailed against even such a varied field if it hadn't been for the way the property tax rebate was constructed. Just don't think that, you know.
Now, as you leave New Jersey to go to Washington, how much attention did you give to the campaign back in New Jersey?
I really didn't have the ability to give it as much attention as I would have liked because I was 15 hours a day in trying to construct this new entity down there and make my way with a group of people that I didn't know before, and felt pretty at sea down there. So almost every waking hour was trying to get on top of that situation.
Well, describe more the reasons for creation of the Northeast Midwest Institute and your role.
Yeah, I'm glad to do that because Brendan and maybe to a little lesser extent, or a little less direct an extent, Dick Leone and Cliff Goldman, the deputy treasurer, all had a lot to do with it succeeding. During the last year of my tenure there, so the third year, a lot of my work was given over to this intergovernmental fiscal stuff, and by then we had discovered that we needed to make common cause with other governors, and we had launched an effort in the Northeast to create an organization that still exists called the Coalition of Northeastern Governors. And the first project of this entity that we basically created on paper among really just among a group of interested staff people from the different governor's offices, particularly Carey's and Shap's and Ella's office. The northern New England folks were less directly involved, but the first project was to create an agenda of urban policy initiatives that the Northeastern governors wanted the next president to embrace, whoever the next president was going to be, whether it was Carter or Ford. We wanted them to embrace an agenda that we felt was vital to the interests of our region, which we identified as the interests of old, struggling cities, primarily. And so we call it the 100 Days Project. And we hammered out an initial version of this agenda just by conference call and one meeting that we had at Princeton University with staff from different places and from Capitol Hill. One or two people from Congressman Harrington's office, because Harrington was even then very interested in this stuff and was putting together some kind of regional caucus. Didn't know much about it. And so then we had this very interesting and exciting conference that the governors sponsored to kick off the organization's life up in Saratoga Springs, I think in October, just before the presidential election, where we got some of the region's best and brightest minds, most famous economists and so forth, to come together and basically validate this agenda and adopt it with some hoopla and get some momentum behind this agenda. So it was people like Lilienthal, the great builder of the TVA system, and other luminaries from the region. A young economist at Princeton called Alan Blinder, who then became head of Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors a long time later, and so forth. But that was the quality of about 150 people that we had up at the conference, the big old hotel conference center at Saratoga. And then, as soon as Carter was elected, we sought a meeting with Carter, which he graciously allowed us to have with him within a few weeks of his election at Blair House, presented the agenda, and he said, "Yeah, I like this agenda. I'm gonna go with this in my first 100 days." And we were just blown away that we could pull this off. And I personally was blown away that a bunch of young staff could get all this done. So that got me fired up emotionally and intellectually about what could be accomplished with this sort of regional, bipartisan or nonpartisan focus. So when I heard about this job, I had been down in Washington looking for other jobs with the Carter administration because Fred Bowen by then was secretary to Joe Califano, who was head of HEW, in those days, Health, Education, and Welfare, before they created the separate department. I think, yes, it was before they created the separate. And so I was looking for jobs there and elsewhere, and then up on the Hill, they invited me to look at this job real seriously. And Michael Harrington was kind of a almost charismatic thinker and talker about these issues, and he had organized this very impressive bipartisan coalition reaching all the way out to Minnesota and Iowa, and theoretically 218 votes in the House and 36 votes in the Senate if we got them all voting together. And the opportunity seemed like a big opportunity to get some things done. Plus, they were going to pay me twice as much as even my newly increased salary at the State House. But of course, I asked the governor, "Do you think this is a good move? And by the way, can you help me make sure that we got enough money to pay me and maybe a researcher at $100 a week?" And he said, "Well, what's your plan?" I said, "Well, I'm going to be looking for $25,000 from the largest states in the whole northeastern and midwestern region, including Dan Walker's state of Illinois. But it will help me enormously if I know that I can count on you at least for New Jersey's $25,000. And he said, "Well, of course, that goes without saying. And tell me which governors you want me to call if you start to run into problems with any of these other guys." And so only with that kind of support from him, which was delivered to me directly and personally, was I willing to get on the train and move my extremely pregnant wife down to Washington and get this thing going, which was physically lodged on a typing table. You know those folding typing tables? Well, there wasn't room in Congressman Harrington's office to pull up the wings of that typing table. So I had a typing table, a phone with my own phone number, and we had a protective 501c3 from an institute in Columbus, Ohio, that was going to be able to help set up our payroll and all that kind of stuff, and protect us with a 501c3 until we could get our own. And but without the support of Brendan Byrne and the sort of vision of his and Dick's and Cliff's, as I recall, no, we wouldn't have done it. we wouldn't have gotten it off the ground, I don't think.
Did you ever have to ask Brendan Byrne to
No.
prod any other governors?
No. He may have done it on his own. I suspect that he did, but I've never, I don't think I've ever asked him that.
Now, how long were you at the Institute?
6 years.
And then you moved on to Wall Street, as I recall.
Yeah, yeah. By then, I had 3 kids, and I was starting to worry about whether I could send them to college. And I also, I guess this happens to a lot of people, but I created this organization. Then I found I was spending most of my time fundraising for it, not doing the policy research, and which I really enjoyed. And I created the board, and then the board seemed to want a life of its own, and I started to get crosswise with them about various things. And I quit after 6 years, and did some consulting work in Washington and helped get the Council of Great Lakes Governors started with some consulting work for a guy called Hal Bergen out there who was still working for Pat Lucy at the time. And then a friend of mine, since deceased, was being headhunted for this job at Lehman Brothers, which was trying to expand its public finance practice into the old industrial heartland states. And I thought, well, this is a 2 or 3 year gig, and my basic role is to help them market in the state governments that I'd become familiar with through my other work. And certainly for the first year or so, that's what the job was. But then I got really interested in the deals themselves and the construction of the deals, which I've always seen as sort of architectural. I've never been very good at math, but my father's an architect, and maybe that's why I see transactions as sort of three-dimensional entities, cash flows, and that. And I ended up staying 10 years there, doing public finance, and being able to put enough away to be pretty sure I could send my kids to college and start paying off my mortgage. And then I quit again because I wanted to do this work internationally in the emerging markets, which were starting to decentralize governments all over the world. And when the wall came down, I wanted to get involved in Central Europe and in South Africa when apartheid ended. And so I've been involved in these same issues, particularly the capital finance part of these same issues ever since about '92.
Okay. Yeah. Before we close, any thoughts on Brendan Byrne personally or the Byrne administration that you'd like to add for the record?
Well, I mean, with time, it looks more and more like a golden period to me. Now, it's very difficult for me to know how much of that is real objective, judgment, and how much of it is just that I'm getting old. But I do feel that because public service was the fundamental motivation of so many of the people we served with, from the governor on down and on out, that it really was a kind of a golden era, and certainly the governor himself epitomized all that for me, and that view of him has never changed. I've actually only gotten to know him personally very well in the last couple of years, for sort of mysterious reasons. We've seen each other. We saw each other at a party. He asked me to lunch, and so I probably know him way better now personally than I ever did then. I'm sure that's true. The only time that I really felt that that I was getting close to him personally was on a trip to Washington about these issues. And on the spur of the moment, he took us out to dinner, and we had one of those wonderful 2 or 3 hour gab fests about public issues and public life and so on. But that was pretty rare for my level of rank in the in the hierarchy. But I've certainly had a lot of chance to reflect on him as a figure and on him as an exponent of a period of time in government. And I really think he does epitomize a period of time when serving in government was not regarded so much as a profession or a career as it was regarded as a calling. And I've talked a fair amount about this with Bob Edgar, who is a minister, as well as having been the congressman and chairman of the Northeast Midwest Congressional Coalition, and who knows what it is to be called to a ministry, but who also knows what it is to be called to public service, and he doesn't see much difference. But there's a huge difference between those two callings and going to work for Lehman Brothers. You know, it's just a huge difference. The current crop doesn't see it that way. They see serving in office as a career. And I think that's why we get this, particularly among Democrats who don't have other means or a lot of inherited money, something like that, why we see multiple office holding, because they see their full-time career as elected service. And the only way they can put their kids through college is by holding 2 or 3 of these jobs. You know, and I think it didn't used to be that way.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm honored.